April 2007, another book about Vietnam once again struck the attention of American readers. Perfect Spy, an incredible double life of Phạm Xuân Ân. And in October, the book was translated into Vietnamese and became the bestsellers list. The author of the book is Professor of History, writer Larry Berman. Berman's book appears 32 years after the war, yet, amazingly, adds significantly to Americans' understanding of what happened during the American War in Vietnam. In Perfect Spy, Professor Larry Berman chronicles the extraordinary life of one of the 20th century's most fascinating spies. The book tells a compelling story of a proud warrior who did what he had to do for his country. He did it well. Within only 4 months after its publication, over 20,000 copies have been sold out, a record in history books in the US.
Hello and welcome to Talk Vietnam. Today's show is a very special one, and we have the honor of inviting Professor Larry Berman to the program. He is the author of The Perfect Spy, the incredible double life of Phạm Xuân Ân, who we'll talk about later on the program. But today he's going to share with us his journeys in writing the book, as well as talk about his experience speaking with Mr. Ân himself, and also his experience as a professor in history at the University of California, Davis. So thank you, Professor Larry Berman, for joining us on the program today.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Taking the time in your busy schedule, I know that. I first want to just get into, you know, there have been other authors who've written about Phạm Xuân Ân. And for one is Jean-Claude Piemonte, who wrote Quiet Vietnamese. Also Thomas A. Bass wrote the article Spy Who Loved Us. Vietnamese author Ngọc Hai, who wrote Phạm Xuân Ân, his name and his life. Now, Perfect Spy, how do you see that it's different from the other publications?
That's a great question. I am An's official biographer. That is, for over 20 years, many people had wanted to write about An, and An had said no. And he said no for many reasons. Jean-Claude Piemonte, the book you mentioned, it's an interesting book, but of course he and An were friends and they were journalists during the war, and there's almost no real research being done in that book. The Bass article is just a short article, but in my case, I was able to convince An at a late stage in his life that an American historian should write his story. It was very important that both the Vietnamese and the Americans hear that story. And I think my book differs from the amount of research I did, and because it was authorized by An himself.
So he gave his blessing to do the book, as well as your personal interaction with him makes your book different. You first met Phạm Xuân Ân in 2001. Can you just give us your initial impression of him?
Yes, I met him. He walked into a restaurant that I had been invited for a dinner party in which there were 20 people already seated, and there was only one empty seat, and it was directly across from me, the way you and I are sitting.
That's kind of lucky, as I would say.
And everyone spoke Vietnamese at the table, and I don't speak Vietnamese, so it was going to be a very long evening, and I was already hoping the beer would be cold. And An walked in, and our host, Jim Reckner, said, "Hello, General An," and An said in English, "I'm sorry I'm late, I was delayed." And there was only one seat. He sat down, and he introduced himself as Phạm Xuân Ân, and I said, "My name is Larry Berman. I'm a professor from the University of California, Davis." And he said, "Davis? That's right near Sacramento. I interned in the Sacramento Bee." And for the next 3 hours, we discussed An's time in America, his life, and all of his famous reporter friends, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, and the like. But he never once mentioned that he was also someone else, that he had another history. He never mentioned it, but we had a delightful time, and he asked me to see him the next day to talk about my book No Peace, No Honor, and that established the beginning of our relationship. I found him to be a very interesting, witty man with a great sense of humor, very engaging, and his mind was very sharp.
Now, as your relationship progressed with him, how, did your idea of him, mentality of him change along with that?
Well, when I first met An, he was really the first Vietnamese intelligence agent I'd ever spoken to, and his English was very good. And so for me, there were two good things about this. First of all, he had a lot of knowledge about the war. He had his English was great, so I didn't need an interpreter, and he and I could talk about a whole range of things. And at first I was very impressed by what I think almost all of his friends were impressed about, that he was engaging, that he could carry a conversation. He had this great sense of Vietnamese history and tradition, and also an understanding of the Americans. And if you took the time to listen, An had a lot to say, and he helped teach me quite a bit before I ever began this project. Before he ever told me I could write the book of his life, he taught me a lot about Vietnam, Vietnamese culture, but also how much he benefited from his experiences in America, and how much he benefited from his friendships with Americans.
Would you say that, from his teachings you about the Vietnamese culture and Vietnam's history, it gave you kind of a foundation to write his story?
It did provide me with an essential foundation. I had written 4 books actually on Vietnam before I met An, but I thought that I knew Vietnam. But when I met An, I realized that I really, for all I saw, I really understood very little, and he helped me to bridge that necessary gap to write a book through the eyes of a Vietnamese hero and an American journalist, what the war was all about.
Now, 2001 was when you met him, and it wasn't until 2003 that he gave you the green light to write this autobiography, or this biography, I'm sorry. So what was it? Many people, he didn't give permission to anyone else prior to that to write his story, but he gave it to you. Now, how did you go about persuading him?
Well, I tried every persuasive mechanism possible, and he kept saying no and no. And then An became gravely ill, and there was a picture of him. I was in Saigon at the time, and there was a picture of him in the hospital with an oxygen mask over his face. And it said that General Pham Son An is near death. He has emphysema in his lungs. And I wrote on a long letter expressing my hopes that he would cheat death because he had cheated death so many other times in his life. Being a spy, there were many close calls that he really had. And I said, I hope one day we can see each other again. I thought he would never see the letter. And a few months later, I received word that he was home, and that he would like me to come and visit him, and that he would like me to bring him 3 books. He was always asking me to bring him books to read. Now, when I got to Ho Chi Minh City and I called on An at his home, he was very frail. He didn't look very well. His mind was still as sharp as ever. And I beseeched him. I said to him, look, I said, you only have a short time to live. He thought he only had about 6 months. And I said, your story needs to be told. It is an amazing story. And it should be told by an American historian, someone who didn't know you as a friend during the war, someone who has written an objective series of books. And An looked at me and he said, okay, you're right. And I had an immediate sense of I've got to get this done because he could die tomorrow. And of course, An lived for 3 years, but I didn't know he would live for 3 years. So I made 20 trips to Vietnam, literally almost every month. I would come for 2 weeks, go back to the States, write everything up, come back again. I took a year sabbatical, and he kept going and going. And so I was able in the 3 years to have access that I'm sure at the beginning he never thought we would have 3 years together.
Right.
Yeah.
Professor historian Larry Berman met Pham Son An in July 2001, but until 2003 did Mr. An agree to let Berman write about his life. Larry Berman used to ask why An never wrote diary and received the answer that An doesn't want his secrets to have an effect on those alive and relatives of the past. Berman spent 4 years altogether from 2003 to 2006 to write the book Perfect Spy. He made over 20 trips to Vietnam to gather information and talk to Pham Son An, interview An's college, friends and family. Each time he spent 2 weeks in Vietnam and made use of time to talk to Pham Son An. Both he and Phạm Xuân Ân knew that there was not much time left because at that time, Ân was very weak.
In the 3 years that you spent with him, that was collecting information, but the total time that it took to write the book, how long was that?
It took me a year to write, a year and a half to really write the book. I went through a first draft. I circulated it confidentially to my friends. I had then follow-up interviews I had to do. And then I just didn't come here to Vietnam to interview An. I came here to interview members of his network, his intelligence network, Mai Chi Ta, Tu Kang, others, his courier, Win Thi Ba. So all of this took time and then translation and all the like.
Very thorough process for you then to do the fact-checking kind of.
And very intense, especially in the United States where I had to go to many archives because I discovered Pham Xuân An in archives all across the United States, in California at the Hoover Institution, in Wisconsin. No, letters, primary source materials. For example, his closest friend in Vietnam was Robert Chaplin, the Far East correspondent for the New Yorker. And when Chaplin died, all of his personal papers and effects were deposited in Wisconsin. And I went out there, and there I found all of Chaplin's reporters' notebooks in which he interviewed An as a source from 1960, 62, 63, 68, 73, 75 on subjects like the coups, the Americanization of the war. Chaplin's notebook on asking An, how did the VC infiltrate into Saigon in the 1968 Tet Offensive? And An, the man who had planned it, and the man who had actually designed the entryways, telling Chaplin, well, this is how they did it, this is how they did it, because the key to being a good spy was being an even better reporter, having a perfect cover. No one could ever suspect him. So he was actually a great source.
There's a wealth of information in the United States itself. Now, you mentioned that you traveled to Vietnam about 20 times to meet with Mr. An, General An. After that, was there any more traveling for you to get more information, like total, to do this entire book? How many times did you travel?
Probably about 22 times altogether. An died. I was in the United States. I did not come for the funeral, but I did come about 2 months later. And I met with his wife and his son, and I was at a crucial stage of trying to finish the book. An never wanted to see the book until it was done, so An never saw the book.
You interviewed his wife and his son, and he managed to play this incredible double life, as you say, for 20-some years. How secret was it to his family?
That's a great question, and the answer most people find very interesting. His wife certainly knew about it, but not when they got married. She actually assisted him in when he was write his reports, and she would sometimes stand guard and make sure things were okay. And she, of course, her other job was to make sure the family life was all normal so that he could carry out his mission.
How much did he divulge to you? How much he really shared with her?
He shared quite a bit with her. The children knew nothing. The children knew nothing. Well, the children were young. And the children knew nothing about their father until he was made a hero in 1978. Until that time, the children did not know. The children were evacuated with, An's cover was so perfect that as Saigon was falling in April of 1975, An sent his wife and his 4 children to the United States. They lived first they went through processing at Camp Pendleton. They lived with all the other Vietnamese refugees in California, and they settled in Virginia. The children went to Patrick Henry High School, elementary school, and they thought they would never see their father, and a very lonely time for An. But then there was some debate about whether or not the Politburo would send An to America to continue his mission, but it was decided that that would not happen, and he was ordered to recall his family. And as you know, and as all your viewers know, very few people, especially Vietnamese, in 1976 were trying to get back into Vietnam. And so it was a as soon as that happened, most of An's friends knew that there was something different about him.
In the process of writing the book and speaking to Pham Xuân An, you also talked to the other members of his intelligence team, which was H63, is that right? Can you tell me a little bit about those meetings that you had with his colleagues?
But they were very valuable. The members of 863, they took me up to Kochi, and they took me on a river trip along the Mekong, and they showed me where they would meet on. They showed me their secret little rendezvous places. They took me into the forest to show me where their to the old house that is still there. That was their VC safe house, and they explained to me the entire system and how they would rendezvous with on, and how the network would protect these microfilm reports of his and the like. And I developed, I think, I got a lot of valuable information from my interviews with them and with his direct supervisor of 863, a man by the name of Tu Kang, who very, very important figure in my book, and also a very famous writer and poet himself in Vietnam. So those were all very valuable.
During the war in Vietnam, Time reporter Phạm Xuân Nân befriended everyone who was anyone in Saigon, including American journalists such as David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, the CIA's William Colby, and the legendary Colonel Edward Lansdale, not to mention the most influential members of the South Vietnamese Kuomintang Army. None of them ever guessed that he was also providing strategic intelligence to the Liberation Army of North Vietnam, transporting invisible ink messages to the jungle inside egg rolls. His early reports were so accurate that General Võ Nguyên Giáp joked, "We're now in the U.S. war room." For more than 20 years, Phạm Xuân Nân lived a dangerous life, and no one knew it because he was a master of both his jobs. After the war, and was named a hero of the People's Army and promoted to general, one of only 2 intelligence officers to ever achieve that rank.
I think this is the one question that I really want to ask is, Perfect Spy, you named the book that, and we can tell from the book why he was, but to you, why did you choose the name Perfect Spy?
It's a great question. I really thought hard about what to call this book, and the author's hardest job is to come up with a title for your book. Perfect Spy refers to 2 things. One is On's perfect cover. In order to be a spy, one has to develop a persona, a cover, something that will hide you from someone. This man, for 20 years, lived every single day of his life by going into Time magazine headquarters or Reuters or the New York Herald Tribune around reporters whose job it is to sniff news, right?
Find the story,
but he could walk in also to work with CIA officers. He could every day he could go into Givral and meet with South Vietnamese commanders, politicians, and the like, and also military people, and no one ever suspected. To me, that made him a perfect spy because of the nature of his perfect cover, which was to become an extraordinarily good journalist, yet at the same time use that access to get materials, build up trust, and then when people trust you, they give you documents. Han never stole a document. Everything was given to him. His cover was so good, and this is really actually, when you think about it, funny, and it's almost like I'm making this up, but it's true, which is that the South Vietnamese created the CIO, which is the Central Intelligence Organization, that was modeled after our CIA, and they asked An to be a consultant on the creation of it. So he helped create the CIO, and then everyone liked him so much and thought he was so good that then they always gave him information. And the information he got, then he would take home and work with his wife holding the light or standing guard. He would write out the reports, analyze them, take microfilm pictures, photos, and then wrap them the next day in traditional Vietnamese rolls and head off to the market where he would meet his courier, Nguyen Thi Ba, who I interviewed for this book too. And Ba would then bring them halfway to Kochi, where another member of 863 would pick them up and take the rest of the way. And the entire 863 network were promoted to the rank of hero because of what they did. Yeah. So that's why I call it Perfect Spy.
Now, speaking more about your book, you wrote about how occasionally would save the lives of his friends, the stories about when he saved the lives of his friends who weren't in the forefront. And you spoke about them in the book, but can you tell us a little bit about some of his friends that he managed to save their lives?
Well, the book begins actually with my first chapter is a book, it's a chapter that's titled Wa Bin, I guess in Vietnamese means peace, peace. And An saved the life of a Time magazine reporter by the name of Robert Sam Anson. And the story is very moving. Anson arrived in Vietnam, and in 1970, 71, he was already against the war. And the person who he befriended was Pham Son An. And An would spend a lot of time speaking to him about Vietnamese history and culture and the like. But Anson was kicked out of Saigon by Time magazine. They didn't want him covering the war. They sent him to Cambodia. And when he was in Cambodia, he was captured. And no one knew if he was captured by the Cambodians or by the Vietnamese. The reason when news came of his capture, Pham Son An was very, very concerned and felt that he had to try to save Anson's life. But the reason was, first of all, he had a good heart towards the Vietnamese Revolution, the Vietnamese people. He didn't think Anson did not believe that America belonged to Vietnam. But Bob Anson had saved the life of many Vietnamese children during the Cambodian massacre at Takeo. So that made Anson a friend of the Vietnamese forever for saving the life of these children. And Pham Son An risked everything. His cover, it was one of the few times where he sort of went out of his mold, and what he did was he sent a message to headquarters saying that I need to know right away if Robert Sam Anson is in our captivity or he's being controlled by the Cambodians or if he's dead. But if he's alive, I order you to release him because you know how valuable I am to you down here, and this man needs to be released. He is a friend of the Vietnamese. He saved us at Takeo. Now, if that message had been intercepted or the courier carrying that message and someone read that, they would be able to trace it back to An. It was at a great risk, very reckless. Indeed, his direct supervisor thought he should not have done it. No one knew when he did it at the time. Anyway, it worked out. The message came back, and Anson was released. And it wasn't until 10 years later when Anson came back to Vietnam that he asked An, tell me about my release. And An told him the whole story. And Anson was a big source of mine in this book, as was An, and they both provided me with incredible material. And I'm the first one to really tell that story.
Now, we're talking about his other American friends. After learning that An was a spy, they kept that information to themselves. They thought of him as a good friend. Now, why do you think that is? The story just a moment ago is a very good example.
I think one of the biggest puzzles of An's life involves his friends' reaction to An after they discovered that he was a spy. Because let me rephrase it just like this. What does a person do when they learn that this person that they thought they knew and the friendship they thought they had was based upon a lie, a deception, that this person was really someone else, but not only someone else, he was a spy. Spies are, in history, not the most dispassionate, liked people.
Figures, yeah.
But it didn't seem to bother any of Pham Son An's good friends. It didn't bother Neil Sheehan, David Halberstam, Stanley Carnow, Stanley Cloud, Bob Chaplin, Francis Fitzgerald. Indeed, they all came back to see him, and the reason is, I believe, is that, and I've thought about this and I talk about this in a book, is that virtually all of these reporters who covered the war, these war correspondents, saw the war the same way Pham Son An did, which is that they didn't hold him responsible for being a spy because America, in their eyes, didn't belong in Vietnam, and that An was a nationalist defending his country. When I asked An about this, An, it's in the book, he slammed his fist one day and he said to me, he goes, what would you do, if 500,000 man army invaded the state of California? That's how big Vietnam is. Wouldn't you fight to defend your country? He goes, I love the Americans. I just wanted them out of my country. He goes, what was so hard to understand? He said, David Halberstam, my friends understood that because they listened. He goes, but some Americans didn't understand that. So of course we had to fight them. But I had nothing against them. I just wanted them to go home. This had to be settled between the Vietnamese. And he was right.
His friends didn't see it as a betrayal at all, like he was any way deceiving them.
No, as a matter of fact, they didn't even think they were, it didn't bother them, even if An had used things that they had told him as source material for his intelligence reports. It didn't bother them at all.
In the book, there's the photo of An's son, and he's standing next to President Bush. Do you have a story behind that photo in the book?
Oh, there's a big story behind that photo. An's son is the official interpreter, has been the official interpreter twice now for meetings between President Bush and President Triet. One in Washington and one here in Vietnam.
It's a bringing together of two countries, and you say An is a symbol of reconciliation and peace, and like his son, bringing together two countries in a language, common language. Can you explain more about what you mean by saying Mr. Pham Son An is a sign of reconciliation and peace?
An became one of the leading forces in reconciliation behind the scenes between Vietnam and the United States. An first met Americans in 1957, 58, and 59, before the war. And one of the things he recognized was that the Vietnamese people and the American people have so much in common and so much humanity, so much goodness in them. And then this war came, and this disrupted the relations between our two societies, and there was this discord between that. And after the war, An said, "The war is over, our country is unified, let us be friends with the Americans." An began working very, very hard, talking to people about the value of reconciliation and the like, and this was symbolized by the fact that in 2003, when the first U.S. vessel, the ship, the USS Vandergrift, came into Saigon Harbor, the VIP on board as a guest of the U.S. Ambassador Raymond Burkert and the Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, the guest of honor was Pham Son An, because he represented the two cultures that were now friends, both his Vietnam homeland and the United States.
Well, during his trip to Vietnam this time, Professor Berman had a meeting with fans of the book Perfect Spy, and there wasn't enough time for him to answer all their questions, but we're going to take a look at some time he spent with 200 people at an event organized by the New Agency Publishing House in Hanoi.
Over 200 readers and researchers flocked to Vietnam News Agency Publishing House to talk to Larry Berman, author of Perfect Spy. This is a rare chance for them to ask all questions about the book, especially the author's memories about Pham Son An and stories that haven't been told in the book.
Cảm nhận của tôi về tác giả Larry là ông giáo sư đã viết dường như không phải là bằng một cái như là một công việc, mà có lẽ ông viết bằng một cái như là một cái sứ mệnh để nói lên chân dung một con người, cuộc đời sự nghiệp của một người đáng rất là trân trọng. Và khi mà gặp cuốn sách lại thì có lẽ là câu hỏi còn vẫn rất là nhiều, như là cuộc đời của ông Pham Son An.
Young people of today are lucky to live in peace, but they really need such valuable books like Perfect Spy to learn about a personality, about how to work and contribute to their nation.
Buổi giao lưu ngày hôm nay thì được tổ chức làm cho không chỉ có giới báo chí mà cả độc giả cũng rất là thích, bởi vì là có cơ hội để tiếp cận với tác giả cuốn sách và để hiểu thêm về cuốn sách, về những cái có thể là đằng sau những cái con chữ viết ra thì được hiểu thêm về cuốn sách và về tác giả cũng như về cái nhân vật ở trong tác phẩm rất là nhiều. Thì thế là tôi rất thích.
Undergoing the war, understanding what the war is like, but today veteran Vo Như Loan came to the meeting to find more about soldiers who had been fighting in a silent but dangerous front.
Tác phẩm này nó đã giúp cho tôi hiểu được nhiều điều trong cái cuộc chiến tranh vừa qua, mà sẽ đi là làm nên những cái chiến thắng đó là cái sự hy sinh của nhân dân, thì trong đó cái người làm nên những cái việc, tức là lấy được những cái tin tức, mà có thể nói là cuộc chiến đấu mình thắng người là nhờ được biết người.
The American author and Vietnamese war veteran Vo Nhi Loan now share the same admiration for the greatest spy of the century, a man who has devoted all his life for his country, Vietnam.
You have a warm reception, I think, when you come to Vietnam. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel great. I mean, I'm so happy that my book has received the reception it has. I mean, I wouldn't be on this show otherwise, and I get to meet you, and I get to be seen by viewers everywhere. So who wouldn't be happy? So I'm very happy, and also it's a humbling experience too, because I'm an American writer writing about a Vietnamese general and a spy. And the book has been received very well by the Vietnamese people. To me, that's a very important accomplishment, and I'm very proud of that.
When you were writing the book, what did you want your readers to get out of it? Was there some purpose or some message that you wanted readers to get?
That's a great question, because first of all, when I was writing this book, I never thought there would be a Vietnamese edition, so I was only writing for an American audience, and whatever Vietnamese would buy the book or get the book, or maybe buy it for $1.50 at the street corner in a Xerox copy, but I never thought I would have a published book. So when I was writing the book, I was writing for an American audience, and I wanted them to understand the war through the eyes of Pham Xuan An. And I wanted them to understand the concepts of what it meant to be a Vietnamese nationalist, what nationalism meant, what it meant for a Vietnamese to want to defend his country and love his country, but at the same time admire and respect America, but also to understand the limits of American, what I call hubris, which is that America thought they could just come to Vietnam and they would make life better for the Vietnamese. Well, we didn't understand Vietnamese history, culture. We didn't understand our enemy, and as someone said to me today, a very distinguished professor here in Vietnam, now retired, he said it was the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong place, the wrong allies, and the wrong enemy. That explains everything. And I was trying to communicate that through the eyes of Pham Xuan An.
There's a large population of Vietnamese Americans in the United States, and they're concentrated in certain areas. But when you did those tours, what was the response that you got?
It's been very divided. It's very interesting. It's very painful for a veteran to feel that they served in a war that America lost, and they went home and they were treated so badly, and now when I write about An, that anger is still there. But I've been welcomed into Vietnamese American community book signings in Westminster, in Arlington, Alexandria, Virginia, Houston, Texas, all over. I have many of my closest friends are Vietnamese Americans, and many of them understand An, and many of them don't. And it's just the way it's going to always be, and I've accepted that.
Now, your visit to Vietnam this time, is it to go again promote the book? What is your aim this time?
My aim this time was to meet all the readers. My publisher, Vietnam News Agency Publishing, brought me over to meet the hundreds and hundreds of readers who want to meet me. I've gone into shops and people have seen me and asked me to sign my book. It's sort of flattering in a way. I feel like an aging rock star, you know, and signing books all the time. It's been very flattering and very interesting, and to see the articles in the news, and to so I've been doing that. And also I'm very grateful for the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Consulate for creating programs for me here, and there's a great interest. At the National Library yesterday, over 200 people came to listen to me talk about my book, which is, again, humbling and very, very exciting.
The book is in the process of becoming a film, possibly. I've read that you've been talking to a screenwriter and a screenwriter Daniel Blake Smith, Phoenix Films, and talking about turning this book into a film. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's my dream. Well, actually, what happened is I have optioned the book already, and Daniel Blake Smith has finished the script, and the script, indeed, I brought to Vietnam, and I shared it with a few people. It's also circulating in Hollywood right now, but he owns the option, and so I'm just the guy who wrote the book. So at the end, one day, it'll say, based upon a book by Larry Berman, but it's his hope, and he's retained me as a consultant on the project, and if it is made into a film, It's my hope that it's shot in Vietnam, but it would be a major motion picture. That is, the goal of it is that it would attract American audiences. So it's a book really about it's a film about friendship between Robert Sam Anson and Pham Xuan An, and also about the war and about reconciliation.
Books are turned into films. A lot of the in-between time, the story changes. How do you feel about taking the premise of Perfect Spy and then turning that into the film? Do you want to keep it the way it was, or the way you wrote it, or?
I would love to keep it, but I've reconciled myself to the fact that I will not be able to stop it.
Professor Larry Berman is now a lecturer in history at the University of California, Davis. Before writing Perfect Spy, he is already the author of 3 other books about the American war in Vietnam. Planning a Tragedy, the Americanization of the war in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson's War, the Road to Stalemate in Vietnam. And No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam. He provides in-depth analysis about the American war in Vietnam, the reasons why the U.S. lost the war, and American politics during the time of the war. He admitted all these books were written through the eyes of an American historian. But with the book Perfect Spy, he began writing and looking at Vietnam through the eyes of the Vietnamese people.
Before writing Perfect Spy, you wrote 3 other books, and we'll talk about your other books about Vietnam. What makes Perfect Spy different from your previous books?
This is the first book. This is my first biography, first of all, and it's the first time that I've looked at the war through the eyes of the Vietnamese. The other books were all America-centered. That is, they looked at American intervention, American negotiations, and another book on Lyndon Johnson and how the war destroyed his presidency and destroyed really his own psyche. But all of those were from the perspective of the Americans, and in which there were Americans and then there were these enemies. This book looks at the war through the eyes of Pham Xuan An, which is a very complicated life, because it's a story of Vietnamese nationalism. It's a story of a patriot who loved his country, and the story of a man who also admired so much about the United States.
Now, just to recount some of the other books that you've done about Vietnam, we have No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, War, The Road to Stalemate in Vietnam, Planning a Tragedy, and Americanization of the War in Vietnam, and finally The Perfect Spy. What's the next book you're going to write about Vietnam?
I've already signed a contract to write a new book. I'm writing my second biography about a very, very interesting man known to the Vietnamese and the Americans. His name is Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, Z-U-M-W-A-L-T. He was the commander of all naval forces in Vietnam from 1966 to 68, and the man who issued the order to use Agent Orange and defoliate the jungles. He did that because the government of the United States and the chemical companies assured him that these agents were only harmful to, quote, vegetation. And so he issued the order, and his son, Elmo Zumwalt Jr., was a swiftboat commander in Vietnam. And after the war, 8 years after the war, he contracted cancer and died of lymphoma-related cancers directly attributed to Agent Orange and the exposure. So think of the irony and the tragedy of a father issuing that order. But that father also, after his service in Vietnam, became a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the Chief of Naval Operations from 1970 to 1974. And then when his son became ill, he was a retired admiral, a time when admirals play golf and relax and enjoy their grandchildren. Instead, he took on the government, and a man who had dedicated his whole life to the creed of duty and service and honor, led the lawsuit against the government on behalf of Vietnam veterans for greater compensation. And he filed the lead affidavit in which he said, "I was deceived. and so I am writing the story of this man's life, and because it also deals with Agent Orange, it will bring me back to Vietnam many times, because many people here knew Zumwalt, because in 1995 he made a very famous trip before he passed away, in which he came here and met with General Giap, and then was taken out to the various communities to meet, and hospitals to meet Agent Orange victims, and he pushed for greater scientific and medical cooperation between our two countries. So I think this will be of great interest to Vietnamese readers as well as Americans.
And you signed the contract, and that's in the production?
I signed the contract. The book has been announced, and I started my research on it. I think I'll be done in about 3 years. The same publisher, HarperCollins Smithsonian, will publish the book, and Vietnam News Agency also would like to translate it and also show it, distribute it here in Vietnam.
So Vietnam's in your books for the next 3 years at least.
You may not know this, but in my previous life I was Vietnamese.
So there's always connections, aren't you?
That's what my friends say.
That's why you keep coming back. Now, besides talking to the readers and attending meetings this time, on your trip to Vietnam this time, are there other things that have attracted you to come back to Vietnam?
The food.
You like the food, you enjoy the food. What's your favorite dish?
What's my favorite dish? I have many favorite dishes, but I love kabamu. Kabamu, sea bass. I love sea bass and kabamu, and I like shrimp and seafood. Yes,
seafood.
I love it, and of course I love pho.
So, can't live without it.
Can't live without it. Every morning on the corner,
You really were Vietnamese in a past life.
I skip the fancy hotel meals and go to the corner and sit on a little stool and have, get some good food, and not too expensive either. But also the thing about Vietnam is the war is over. It's a beautiful country, and Americans who take time, or visitors, that the Japanese tourists, the American tourists. I mean, I've traveled all over Vietnam, and I've gone off the beaten trail, and I've gone up to Ha Long Bay, but I've also gone down to Can Tho, and I've gone to Dalat and Hue. I just love sitting on the Perfume River and relaxing. So it's really great. I love Hoi An, and I like sneaking off to Dalat once in a while. So it's very nice.
It's very nice, very temperate there. Yeah. Well, it seems like you have a great attachment to Vietnam. I want to thank you for joining us today, sitting down and talking to us, and I wish you all the best success with your next book, and hope to see you again here in Vietnam.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that is all for this Talk Vietnam. We'll talk again next time.